rod Chevrolet small block, the same engine from your neighbor's pickup truck, beat hand-built Ferrari prototypes at Le Mans. Yes, seriously. To understand how absurd that is, you need to know what Le Mans looked like in this era. To understand what happened, you need to understand what Le Mans looked like in the late 1960s and early 70s. And what it looked like was a Ferrari parade. By 1970, Ferrari had won Le Mans 9 times. 9. Enzo Ferrari didn't just like racing. Racing was the entire point of his company. He sold road cars to fund his obsession with motorsport, and Le Mans was the crown jewel. His factory operation at Maranello churned out purpose-built prototypes, hand-assembled by teams of specialists who treated each engine like a piece of sculpture. The 312 and 512 power plants were exotic flat 12 designs with individual throttle bodies, titanium connecting rods, and engineering tolerances that bordered on aerospace. A single Ferrari race engine cost more than most people's homes. The budget for one season of sports car racing exceeded what most privateer teams would spend in a decade. Now Ford had famously gone to war with Ferrari in the mid-60s. The GT40 program, bankrolled by the full weight of the Ford Motor Company, finally broke Ferrari's stranglehold in 1966. Ford won again in 67, 68, and 69. 4 straight. It was one of the great corporate revenge stories in motorsport history. But by 1970, Ford was done. They'd proven their point, spent a fortune doing it, and pulled out. That left a vacuum at the top of endurance racing, and Ferrari walked right back into it. Porsche, too. The 917 became a dominant force. The prototype class was evolving fast, getting more expensive, more specialized, and more exclusive with every passing season. Here's how Le Mans worked in those days. You had different groups racing simultaneously on the same track. Group 5 and Group 6 were the prototypes, the purpose-built machines with no real connection to anything you could buy at a dealership. These were the cars fighting for the overall win. Then you had Group 4, the grand touring cars, production-based machines that had to meet homologation requirements. They were slower than the prototypes, but they raced on the same circuit at the same time, competing for class victories. And here's the thing about Le Mans class wins. They mattered. A lot. Winning your class at the 24 hours was a legitimate achievement, and manufacturers used those results in advertising for years. This structure created an ecosystem where privateer teams could exist. You didn't need a factory budget to go to Le Mans. You needed a car that met the regulations, enough money to get it to France, and a crew willing to work around the clock. The gap between the factory teams and the privateers was enormous, though. Picture the paddock. On one side, scarlet Ferraris surrounded by teams of Italian engineers in matching uniforms with spare engines on stands and hospitality tents serving espresso. On the other side, small crews working out of rented garages, sharing tools, counting every franc. And then there was the circuit itself. The Circuit de la Sarthe was unlike any other track in the world. The Mulsanne Straight ran for nearly 6 kilometers, 6 kilometers of full throttle. Engines screaming at maximum revs for over a minute at a time, lap after lap, hour after hour, for 24 hours straight. That straight alone destroyed more cars than most entire racetracks. Engines overheated, gearboxes shattered, brakes cooked themselves into uselessness at the chicane-less end of the straight. Le Mans wasn't really a race in the traditional sense. It was an endurance test disguised as a race. The car that crossed the finish line first wasn't necessarily the fastest car that started. It was the car that survived. Speed got you nothing if your engine was scattered across the Mulsanne at 3 in the morning. That survival element, that brutal grinding, a mechanical attrition, was the key to everything that was about to happen. Because while a Ferrari Flat 12 was a masterpiece of engineering, masterpieces can be fragile. And a Chevy small block, well, a Chevy small block cost about $500 from a junkyard. So that was the playing field. Now, who was crazy enough to bring an American pushrod V8 to this particular fight? The name you need to know is John Greenwood, a Corvette racer out of Troy, Michigan, who had one dream that bordered on obsession: take his small block-powered Corvette to the 24 Hours of Le Mans and beat the Europeans on their own turf. Greenwood had been campaigning Corvettes in SCCA and IMSA racing for years. He knew the car, he knew the engine, and he was convinced that what worked on American tracks could work at La Sarthe. Then there was Grady Davis, a Texan oil executive and racing enthusiast who helped bankroll some of these efforts. And hovering around the edges was the NART connection, Luigi Cinetti's North American racing team, which had historically been Ferrari's American arm but understood better than anyone how to get unconventional entries onto the Le Mans grid. These weren't dilettantes, they were racers who'd done the math. But the math was not encouraging. The Chevy small block, in race trim, made roughly 400 to 450 horsepower. The Ferrari prototypes they'd be racing against? Over 500, some pushing 550. That's not a small gap. That's a gap that translates to seconds per lap on a circuit where the Mulsanne Straight alone is over 3 miles long. On raw speed, the Chevy couldn't compete. Period. And the European racing establishment made sure everyone knew it. A pushrod engine at Le Mans, 2 valves per cylinder. A design philosophy rooted in Eisenhower-era simplicity, showing up to race against twin-cam, 4-valve-per-cylinder masterpieces from Maranello. The French and Italian press treated it as comedy. The paddock reaction ranged from polite amusement to genuine insult. Who did these Americans think they were? The thing is, Greenwood and his crew chose the Chevy platform for very specific reasons. The small block had been in production since 1955. By the time these Le Mans campaigns were happening, millions of them had been built. Millions. That meant the engine's failure modes were known. Every weakness had been found, cataloged, and solved by decades of hot rodders, oval track racers, drag racers, and weekend mechanics across America. Parts were everywhere. Knowledge was everywhere. You could call a speed shop in California at 2 in the morning and get advice on oil pump modifications from a guy who'd been running small blocks at Bonneville for 15 years. Try doing that with a Ferrari Flat 12. But knowing the engine's strengths didn't mean the early attempts went well. Greenwood's first Le Mans campaigns were brutal. The Mulsanne Straight exposed every thermal weakness the engine had, sustained high RPM running, hour after hour, pushed oil temperatures past 300 degrees. The cooling system, designed for American highway driving with plenty of airflow, couldn't cope with a car running flat out under the French sun. Engines overheated, or oil starved in the high-speed corners where G-forces pushed lubricant away from the pickup. And the gearboxes, often adapted European units, couldn't handle the torque characteristics of an American V8. A small block delivers its power differently than a high-revving Italian engine. More torque, lower in the rev range, and gearbox synchros designed for a screaming Ferrari motor would simply shatter under that kind of load. Cars came back on trailers, engines came back in pieces. The Europeans nodded knowingly, told you so. But Greenwood noticed something that nobody else was paying attention to. While his cars were failing from ancillary problems, cooling and oiling and gearboxes, the actual bottom end of the Chevy V8 was practically indestructible. The crankshaft, the main bearings, the block itself. When the engine did run properly, it just kept running. Meanwhile, the Ferraris were blowing engines too. Exotic, expensive engines that cost 10 times as much to rebuild. Their sophisticated twin-cam heads were cracking. Their complex valve trains were failing. Their gearboxes were grenading from their own mechanical stress. Everyone assumed the American engine was the weak link. Turns out it was the opposite. The thing that looked like a disadvantage, that blue-collar simplicity, was about to become the ultimate weapon in a 24-hour war of attrition. So they had the engine and the audacity. Now they needed to solve the actual engineering problems. And that's where the story gets technical and genuinely clever. Race week at Le Mans is its own kind of theater. Practice and qualifying happen in the days before the race. And that's where the pecking order gets established. The factory prototypes from Ferrari, Porsche, and Matra were laying down blistering lap times on the full 13-kilometer circuit. Down the Mulsanne Straight, the big prototypes were hitting 220 miles per hour. The Ferrari 512, with its 5-liter flat 12 engine, qualified near the front. The Porsche 917 was right there with it. These were purpose-built racing machines backed by factory budgets that ran into the millions. And then there was the Chevy-powered car. It qualified seconds off the pace of the prototypes, not tenths, seconds per lap. On a circuit where the lap time was already over 3.5 minutes, being 10 or 12 seconds slower sounds manageable. But compounded over 350 laps, that gap is enormous. Nobody in the press gave it a second look, but within its GT class, the car was competitive. More than competitive. And the team knew something the stopwatch didn't show. They weren't here to be fast. They were here to be last, as in the last car still running when the checkered flag fell. The race started at 4 p.m. on Saturday. The prototypes launched off the grid like missiles. Within the first hour, the Ferraris and Porsches were already lapping slower traffic, pulling away from the GT field with ease. The Chevy car settled into its rhythm immediately. Conservative engine speeds, smooth braking zones, no heroics. The driver brought it in for the first pit stop right on schedule, fuel and tires, and went back out. Same pace, same line, every single lap. By hour 6, the first cracks started showing in the prototype field. One of the Matra entries came in with electrical problems. The crew swarmed it, but the issue was deep in the wiring loom. It sat in the garage for over an hour before limping back out, hopelessly behind. A Porsche 917 that had been running in the top 3 developed a gearbox issue. The shifts started getting rough around hour 7, and by hour 8, the gearbox was done, retired. Millions of francs of engineering pushed behind the pit wall. Then night fell, and Le Mans at night is a different race entirely. The Mulsanne Straight becomes a 3.5-mile tunnel of darkness with only your headlights and the reflective markers to guide you. Speeds don't drop much. The danger goes up exponentially. This is where Le Mans earns its reputation. Around midnight, one of the leading Ferrari 512s went off at the Porsche curves. The driver was okay, but the car was buried in the sand trap. Bodywork crumpled. Done for good. By 2 a.m., another Ferrari prototype was parked behind the pits. Cracked engine block. The flat 12 that had been screaming at 9,000 RPM for 10 straight hours simply gave up. The block split, coolant everywhere, and that was that. And the Chevy car was still out there. Same pace, same rhythm. The engine temperature gauge hadn't moved in 12 hours. The oil pressure was rock steady. Every pit stop was routine. Fuel, tires, driver change, back out. No drama, no emergency repairs, no frantic mechanics with flashlights trying to diagnose something in the middle of the night. By 3 a.m., the crew chief walked over to the timing board. And he'd been so focused on his own car's reliability that he hadn't been tracking the overall standings. The retirements had reshuffled everything. Cars that started 20 positions ahead were now sitting in garages. The Chevy-powered car had climbed from the middle of the pack into a class-leading position, and not just leading its class. It was creeping up the overall standings, too. He reportedly looked at that board, did the math on fuel stops and pace, and said to his crew, "We might actually do this." Picture that moment, 4 a.m. in the pits at Le Mans. $1 million prototypes being wheeled into garages with blown engines and shattered gearboxes. Factory teams with 50-person crews standing around with nothing to do. And your car, powered by a small block Chevy that cost a fraction of what those exotic engines did, ICE is still circulating, lap after lap. That's not luck. That's the kind of engineering that doesn't care about your budget. So they survived the night. But surviving Le Mans and actually beating Ferrari are two very different things. To understand how the Chevy pulled it off, we need to open the hood, literally. So that happened. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We do deep dives like this every week. All right. Now let's talk about why the Chevy actually survived, because luck doesn't last 24 hours. Engineering does. The Ferrari Flat 12 had 48 valves, 4 camshafts, and 12 individual throttle bodies. The Chevy had 16 valves, 1 camshaft, and a single 4-barrel carburetor. On paper, the Ferrari was superior in every measurable way. But here's the thing about endurance racing. Paper doesn't finish Le Mans, parts do. And every single one of those extra components in the Ferrari was another thing that could break at 3 in the morning on the Mulsanne Straight. The small block's architecture was considered primitive by European standards. Pushrod valve train, 2 valves per cylinder, a design philosophy that hadn't fundamentally changed since 1955. And that was the whole point. 10 million engines had proven this valve train worked. It wasn't cutting edge. It was proven. The push rods and rocker arms had fewer moving parts than Ferrari's double overhead cam setup, which meant fewer failure points, less friction, and less heat generated in the cylinder head. Ferrari's cam chain tensioners wore out during long races. Its exotic valve springs lost tension after hours of sustained high RPM running. And the Chevy's valve train just kept cycling, open, close, for 24 hours straight. Now, the block itself. Cast iron, heavy. The kind of thing a European engineer would look at and wince. But that weight came with a hidden advantage: thermal mass. A cast iron block absorbs heat spikes. When you're running flat out down a 3-mile straight, then braking hard into a tight corner, the engine goes through massive thermal cycles. An aluminum block heats up fast and cools down fast. That sounds good until you realize those rapid temperature swings cause expansion and contraction that can crack the block or blow a head gasket at hour 18. The iron block was like a thermal flywheel. It smoothed everything out. Over 24 hours, that mattered more than saving 100 pounds. The internals told the same story. His forged steel crankshaft. This was a crank designed to survive in a pickup truck for 200,000 miles. At racing power levels, it was barely working. The safety margins were enormous. Ferrari's crankshaft was lighter, more precisely balanced, and made from exotic alloys. It was also operating much closer to its limits, thinner margins, less room for error. The race preparation was smart, but not exotic. They bored the displacement out to around 355 cubic inches. Compression ratio sat at about 11-1. Ferrari ran 12-1. That 1-point difference meant the Chevy could run slightly cooler, with less stress on the head gasket for 24 straight hours. 1 ratio point. That's the margin between finishing and not. Power output landed somewhere between 420 and 450 horsepower on race fuel. Not the most powerful thing on the grid, not even close. But the torque curve peaked low, down around 4,000 RPM, which meant the engine wasn't screaming at the top of its range all night. It also meant less stress on the gearbox. Ferrari's engines made peak power high in the rev range, which meant the transmission was taking a beating every single lap. The oiling system got a full dry sump conversion, windage trays to keep oil from sloshing away from the pickup under hard cornering, high-volume oil pump. The small block's oil galleries were originally designed for a truck application. They were oversized for a racing engine, so when you pushed serious oil volume through them, they handled it without modification. The passages were already big enough. That's not clever engineering for racing. That's accidentally perfect engineering from a completely different purpose. The fuel system stayed simple. Single 4-barrel carburetor, reliable, easy to tune between stints, easy to fix if something went wrong. Ferrari's 12 individual throttle bodies needed synchronization. At 2 a.m. in the pits, with tired mechanics, simplicity wins. So the engine was bulletproof and the modifications were smart. But the small block alone didn't beat Ferrari. The whole car had to survive. Start with the chassis. The tube frame was reinforced and widened with a track that gave the car more stability at speed. The suspension geometry was deliberately tuned for high-speed composure, not low-speed agility. That's a trade-off most racers wouldn't make. You're giving up cornering performance in the tight sections, but the Mulsanne straight was over 3 miles long. You hit that stretch at 180+ miles per hour, and if your car is twitchy, you're not fast. You're dead. So they went with stiffer spring rates, beefier anti-roll bars, and a setup that planted the car at speed. In the slow stuff, the drivers just had to be patient. Then there's the aero. The stock Corvette body was essentially a brick with headlights. At high speed, it actually generated lift. John Greenwood's solution was a wide body kit that looked like nothing else on the grid. Front splitters, massive fender flares to cover wider tires, a rear wing that the Europeans thought was ridiculous. The whole package was developed in Greenwood's shop in Michigan, using hand-shaped fiberglass and what amounted to a homemade wind tunnel. He'd converted a barn, rigged up industrial fans, and used wool tufts taped to the body to visualize airflow. Factory teams were spending hundreds of thousands on wind tunnel time at proper facilities. Greenwood was using a barn and some fans. His wide-body Corvette generated around 800 pounds of downforce at 180 miles per hour. The Europeans called it ugly. It worked. That downforce compensated for the car's biggest weakness, which was weight. The Corvette was heavier than the prototypes. Heavier means more energy going into the brakes every lap. The team ran ducted cooling to the rotors, pulling air directly onto the brake discs. They used larger rotors than you'd normally see on a car this size. And the drivers were coached on lift and coast zones, specific points on the circuit where they'd come off the throttle early and let the car scrub speed before braking. It saved the brakes. It saved fuel. It cost maybe half a second a lap. Over 1,000 laps, that discipline kept the car alive while others cooked their brakes and limped to the pits. Speaking of fuel. The Chevy's efficiency at cruising speed was a genuine strategic advantage. The small block, running at a comfortable pace rather than screaming at redline, sipped fuel compared to the high-strung prototypes. Ferrari's flat 12 engines were thirsty. Every extra pit stop cost 2 to 3 minutes. That adds up. The Corvette team planned their stints to maximize time on track and minimize time in the pits. Fewer stops meant more laps under green. And it meant less chance of something going wrong during a stop. But the hardest part of this whole strategy was the human element. The drivers were given target lap times, not fast laps, target laps, consistent, repeatable, sustainable times they could hit lap after lap for their entire stint. And the instruction was simple. Do not chase the prototypes. When a Ferrari or a Porsche blows past you on the Mulsanne, let it go. Don't react. Don't push. Hold your pace. That sounds easy sitting here. It's not easy at 3 in the morning when you're exhausted, your neck hurts, your vision is blurring from staring at the same headlight pattern for 4 hours, and a car just passed you like you were parked. Every instinct says, go faster. The discipline to ignore that instinct is what separates endurance drivers from sprint racers. These guys drove to a number, hour after hour, through rain, through darkness, through the kind of fatigue that makes you question whether you actually saw that marshal's flag or imagined it. The race ended. The small block survived, and the result sent shockwaves through the racing world. The morning after the race, the European press had a problem. They had to explain how a pushrod V8 built from catalog parts had just embarrassed some of the most expensive racing machinery on the planet. The French papers were diplomatic about it. The Italian press was not. Ferrari's camp was reportedly furious, not just because they'd been beaten in class, but because of what had beaten them. This wasn't a Ford versus Ferrari situation with billions of corporate dollars behind it. This was a guy from Detroit with a Corvette and a phone book full of speed shop contacts. The establishment didn't just lose. They lost to a privateer running an engine architecture from 1955, and the response was predictable. Within 2 years of the Chevy's Le Mans performance, the ACO changed the rules. Stricter homologation requirements, displacement limits for GT cars, minimum weight adjustments. The timing was not subtle. Ferrari reportedly lobbied directly for the changes, and Porsche wasn't far behind. The factory teams wanted production-based American engines out of the equation, or at least handicapped enough to neutralize the advantage. They couldn't beat the small block on reliability, so they rewrote the rulebook to make sure they wouldn't have to. Think about that. The most prestigious racing brand in history couldn't beat a Chevy on the track, so they beat it in the committee room. That tells you everything about how seriously they took the threat. But the damage was already done. The small block had made its point on the biggest stage in endurance racing, and no rule change could erase that result from the record books. Back home, the impact was seismic. John Greenwood became the most famous Corvette racer in history. His wide-body cars with their aggressive fender flares became icons, the kind of machines that ended up on bedroom posters and magazine covers. His approach to racing, that privateer mentality of doing more with less, influenced an entire generation of American sports car competitors who saw Le Mans not as an impossible dream, but as something achievable with the right engine and the right attitude. The IMSA GT series exploded in popularity, and Le Mans credibility was a big part of why. Sponsors who wouldn't have looked twice at domestic sports car racing suddenly saw value in it. The small block Corvette became the backbone of American road racing for decades, not because it was the most advanced option, but because Greenwood and his team had proven it could compete with anything in the world. The philosophical impact might have been even bigger than the competitive one. This result became a case study in motorsport engineering. The best race car isn't the fastest car. It's the fastest car that finishes. Sophistication means nothing if your engine is sitting in a pool of oil at 3 in the morning. The small block proved that a simpler, more reliable architecture could outlast machines with twice the technology and 10 times the budget. As for the people, Greenwood's later career was a mix of triumph and struggle. He kept racing Corvettes, kept pushing the limits, but the financial realities of privateer racing caught up with him. Running a competitive program without factory backing was brutal, and the money wasn't always there. But his legacy was already cemented. The mechanics and engineers who worked on those cars went on to other programs, carrying the knowledge and the philosophy with them. Some ended up in the orbit of teams that would eventually become Corvette Racing's factory program. And here's the thing that really ties it all together. Decades later, when Corvette Racing returned to Le Mans with a proper factory team run by Pratt and Miller, their engine was still a pushrod V8. They went back to the same race, with the same basic engine philosophy, and they won. Again, multiple times. The design doctrine that Greenwood proved in the 70s became official Corvette racing strategy. Simple, reliable, relentless. The Europeans kept building more complex engines, and the Corvette kept finishing races. Now here's what makes this story more than just a cool racing anecdote. The pushrod V8 didn't just show up at Le Mans once and disappear. It kept coming back, and it kept winning. Corvette Racing campaigned pushrod 5.8 derivatives at Le Mans for over 2 decades. From 2001 through 2023, they racked up multiple class victories, all with engines that traced their lineage directly back to that original small block architecture from 1955. 2 valves per cylinder, single cam in the block, push rods. The same fundamental layout that Greenwood bolted into his Corvette in a shop that smelled like cigarettes and gear oil. Think about that. A basic engine architecture designed during the Eisenhower administration was still winning races at the highest level of international motorsport well into the 21st century. That's not nostalgia, that's engineering. And the philosophy behind it shows up everywhere once you start looking. SpaceX builds their Merlin engines around the same principle: simpler designs, fewer failure points, easier to manufacture. Toyota's dominance in endurance racing follows the same playbook. Their hybrid system at Le Mans wasn't the most powerful option available. It was the most durable. It finished races. That's the whole game. As for the cars themselves, Greenwood's original Le Mans Corvettes are still out there. One of them sold at auction for over $2 million. The engine sitting in it was still a small block Chevy, still pushrod, still 2 valves per cylinder, still winning arguments half a century after it was built. You can see others at the National Corvette Museum in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and in private collections around the world. But here's the bittersweet part. The chapter is closing. The C8R moved to a flat-plane crank V8 and eventually hybrid power, marking the end of the traditional pushrod era at Le Mans. What Greenwood started as a privateer effort and Corvette racing carried forward as a factory program has reached its natural conclusion. The last pushrod-derived engines to race at Le Mans did so knowing they were the end of a line. That makes the original story even more meaningful, not less. And look, this isn't really just a car story. It's about a fundamental idea that applies whether you build engines or write software or run a business. The expensive, complicated solution isn't always the best one. Sometimes the most elegant answer is the simplest thing that actually works when everything around it is falling apart. The next time someone tells you the most advanced technology always wins, remember this. A design from 1955 beat the best engineers in Italy. Sometimes proven beats cutting edge. So let's come back to where we started. A pushrod V8, 2 valves per cylinder. A design so simple you could rebuild it on a garage floor with hand tools and a six-pack. That engine, in various forms, has been in continuous production since 1955. Over 100 million built. It powered Camaros and Corvettes, sure, but also pickup trucks, farm equipment, boats, police cruisers. The kind of engine you'd find in any small town in America, sitting in any driveway, doing any job you asked of it. And one weekend in France, it beat Ferrari at the most famous endurance race on Earth. Not with exotic metallurgy, not with a blank check, not with a factory team of hundreds. A handful of guys with a good engine and a plan went to Le Mans and came home with a result that the entire European racing establishment had to sit with. The thing is, this story isn't really about cars, not entirely. It's about what happens when you choose the right tool for the job instead of the most impressive one. It's about preparation over prestige, reliability over raw spec sheets. It's about the fact that sometimes the answer to a very complicated problem is something beautifully, stubbornly simple. Picture the Circuit de la Sarthe at dawn, 20 hours into the race. The garages are full of silent machinery, Ferraris with cracked blocks, prototypes with seized bearings, exotic engines that couldn't survive their own ambition. And out on the circuit, still turning laps, still running clean, is a car powered by an engine you could buy out of a parts catalog. The same basic architecture that was hauling lumber in Missouri on Monday morning. That small block just kept running. It didn't care about reputation. It didn't care about pedigree. It just worked, like it always had, like 100 million of them always had. And that might be the most American engineering story ever told. If you've ever turned a wrench on a small block or your dad did, drop that story in the comments. And if you think I got something wrong, tell me. I probably did. Subscribe if you want more of these. We do this every week.